Hello, audio only listeners. I just want to inform you that there is a video portion to this podcast, and if you're not watching it, you are missing out. Now, there are several corrections in this podcast that I have made, and those come up on the video screen, and I'm going to let you know what those are since you can't see the screen. Discussing sodium, potassium, magnesium in regards to the urinary excretion, I refer to them as recall markers, and the correction should be that they are recovery markers. When discussing the Framingham offspring study, I refer to the calcium chart as the potassium chart, and then I refer to the potassium chart again. So know that when I say that the potassium chart shows that there's no effect because it crosses the null line, I am referring to the calcium chart. Later in that study, we're looking at the lowest amounts of sodium and the highest amounts of potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And several times I say that those show the lowest reduction in risk, and the correction is that those show the lowest risk. It is the highest reduction in the risk. Towards the end of the podcast, I do say that sodium recommendations are 200 milligrams. It should be 2,000 milligrams. And then again, a little later, I say that the sodium recommendations are less than 2 milligrams, and it is less than 2 grams. The correction is 2 grams. So keep that in mind when listening, and I hope you enjoy. What is up, health enthusiasts? It's Coach Lambie here with Working Weights LLC, your guide to strength, fitness, and all things health. I am joined today by my co-host, Dwayne Ulrich, aka Poppy Dworo. And we are going to be talking today about sodium intake and whether or not lower sodium intakes have worse outcomes for you than moderate or high amounts of sodium. Dwayne, how you doing today?
Man, I'm doing great. Just drinking some coffee here and living the life, man.
Living the life. I got my Diet Coke.
Sweet. That's awesome, dude.
Not sponsored.
This cup is sponsored. Never mind. I won't do it.
Yeah.
No, man, it's been hot here, so just enjoying the air conditioning for right now. So.
Yep, it has been cool here, so I'm enjoying the coolness.
Sleeping with the windows open.
Sleeping with the windows. Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Cool.
So, all right, before we get into everything today, I want to direct everybody's attention to the little plaque behind Dwayne, Consuelo Health. So that is Dwayne's wife, Kathy. She's a nurse practitioner, and that is her telehealth business, online business. So I want you guys to go check that out and contact her. She's a fantastic nurse, and she will get you taken care of. Dwayne, anything you want to add to that?
Smartest woman I've ever met. So I figured I better marry her because, somebody's got to take care of me.
Somebody's got to take care.
All right. Take care of me.
Yeah, we're talking about sodium today. And Dwayne, I know you did a little bit of research before we got in this podcast. So tell us a little bit about what you found as the audience ombudsman.
The audience ombudsman is what I found is that so there's a relationship, obviously, and I probably shouldn't even go all off into this, but what I found out is there's a relationship between sodium and potassium. So if one is high, the other one is low. And what we're talking about today is going to be when you're trying to do a low sodium diet, which is good for you. There is too low, and then there's, of course, sodium is too high. So we're also going to be talking about today is like, are there problems with, or are there dangers with sodium levels being too low? And there are some. That's what I found out. But typically, it's more dangerous for older people, say people from the age of like 60-ish and up, because the sodium levels, when they dip down too far, then the side effects of that are typically way more disastrous or dangerous for older folks than they are for younger people, especially like people who are trying to be fit. And I mean, we're talking about nutrition here. So You can get a little bit too low, but there's some warning signs, and it's super hard to get too low. Like if you're a younger person, like well, like probably most of you watching, it's super hard to get too low in your sodium intake, but it's possible. So that's what we're going to talk about. I think Dustin, you're going to give us some numbers to look at as well. And
Yeah, we'll talk about some numbers. We're actually
yep,
going to look at a podcast from Mind Pump on YouTube, and so we're going to play that video,
yep,
and we're going to see what they say about it. So they cover a lot of this stuff, and I think it's good to view some of that stuff because that's kind of how people are getting information is through podcasts and blog posts. And so as we go
right,
along,
right.
we're going to be looking at podcasts and blog posts and addressing some of the information that's getting out to the general public and assessing whether or not a lot of the claims that are being made in these blogs and podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff make sense? Do they hold up to the current scientific understandings? And are a lot of the resources that they're citing applicable to what they're talking about? Or are they citing things appropriately? So we're going to watch this clip. There's about 10 minutes there. Maybe we get through all of it, maybe we don't, but we'll have to stop it through certain aspects because YouTube, I'm going to be posting this on YouTube, and YouTube has weird rules about that. So
Yep.
we can't just play it and listen to it and then discuss it. We have to stop it and discuss it. So we're going to get into this thing. Let me share my screen here.
Don't believe the negative hype around sodium, salt. Most of it is flawed or completely wrong. Salt is essential for function, for life. And believe it or not, consuming too little of it has far more dangers for most people than consuming quote unquote too much.
Okay. So we're going to stop it there. So we already have a few claims here, and you're seeing this for the first time. I have taken some notes. So what we have here is don't believe the negative hype about sodium. The science or the evidence behind it is flawed or completely wrong. Salt is essential for function and life, and consuming too little has far more dangers than consuming too much for most people. Agree with that?
I agree with that absolutely. We do. I will say this: we do as people, we do actually take in more sodium than we actually need. I mean, I think I read somewhere that well recently, and it was in a science. It was a it's a legit study from I can't remember. I probably shouldn't even say the name of the hospital, but like the human body only really needs about two spoonfuls of I'd say two, I think it's teaspoons of salt a day, but we consume way more than that. Okay, and it takes a long time, and over a long period of time, that people will develop like high blood pressure. However, taking too little, it's almost yeah. I agree with all of what he just said. Yes.
Okay. Let's play a little more.
All right, so Element did a phenomenal post on Instagram. I'm going to read you some of the stuff because it's exceptional, and I'll tell you guys why.
So he thinks it's exceptional. Okay.
Okay.
The reasons why we still hear
there's fear mongering still around salt. I believe
is totally. So it was a great post. I love posts like this because they have data. They talk about here.
So this company, the Element, I don't know a whole bunch about them, but it's a supplement company, and I think they make an energy drink and like a sports drink, and then they make this electrolyte packet, which contains sodium and potassium and some other things in it, right? So they are, so they put out a tweet. This is back when the FDA, came out with their voluntary recommendation to reduce sodium intake. And so they had some issues with the recommendations, and they felt that they've seen some science that disagrees with that recommendation. So he's going to talk a little bit about that.
What's accepted, common knowledge. Here's why a lot of it's wrong, and here's what's really going on. Right.
Okay.
So The post says that the World Health Organization recommends a worldwide effort to reduce the average daily intake of sodium to about 2 grams of salt. So it's based on the premise that lowering sodium intake would lower blood pressure, leading to fewer strokes, heart attacks, and heart failure, right? So,
okay. So we're going to stop it here. So, the WHO recommends, and this is what he said, limiting sodium to 2 grams of salt. So I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to say that already out of the gate, he's equating sodium and salt. So 2 grams of sodium would not be 2 grams of salt. So the recommendation from the WHO, and we're going to go into my my Mendeley account here. And we're going to look at some.
Hey, while you're looking for that, I just want to say something real quick because I remembered. I want to correct my statement from earlier. So the average, and you're right, sodium doesn't necessarily equate to salt, and salt doesn't necessarily equate to sodium.
Mm-hmm.
However, so the average American eats like 5 or more teaspoons of salt each day. If you could just put all the salt that you eat in a day in spoons, it'd be like 5 or more teaspoons of salt a day, which is about 20 times as much as the human needs. In fact, so most people only need about a 1/4 teaspoon of salt a day. And I can't remember what that works out in grams, but it's not much. And grams of sodium, actually. So salt and sodium don't necessarily always agree.
Yeah. So here is so here's what he's talking about right here. The World Health Organization has recommended a reduction in population salt intake from the current level of 10 grams, around 10 grams, to less than 5 grams. So the recommendation is to reduce salt intake to less than 5 grams per day, and 5 grams of salt would equate to 2,000 milligrams or 2 grams of sodium. So, so there's an issue with what he's already. I feel his understanding of salt and sodium is. He thinks that the two are the same and that those words are interchangeable. And then, so you brought it up a couple times, like what is the obligate amount of sodium required by the human body for life and function? And so this is a Harvard article. And right in here, it's estimated that we need 500 milligrams of sodium daily for these vital functions. So that's our obligate amount, would be 500 milligrams of sodium. In 1 gram of salt, it's about 400 milligrams of sodium. So how much salt do we need? Or rather, we actually don't need any salt. You need the sodium.
Right.
But our main source of sodium intake is through salt. So how much salt would you need to consume in order to get that a little bit more than 1 gram, which equates to what you said, about 1/4 teaspoon, a little bit less than 1/4 teaspoon.
A little bit less. Yeah.
And here, most Americans consume at least 1.5 teaspoons of salt per day. So how much do you need? A little bit less than 1/4. And how much are people actually consuming? 1.5.
Yep.
All right. So let's go back to this.
This is one of those things where we're like, okay, if this does this, then this means that. So like, okay, if we get everybody to reduce their salt, we should get less heart attacks, less strokes. Therefore, it's going to cause improvements in health or whatever. But check out these studies, okay? 2011 study published in the Journal of American Medical Association shows that cardiovascular events were higher in individuals consuming less than 3 grams of sodium per day. The lowest rate of events was at 4 to 6 grams of sodium per day. In 2014, meta-analysis shows that sodium intakes less than 2.6 grams a day were associated with increased cardiovascular disease events and all-cause mortality, compared to intakes that were between 2.6 to 5 grams a day. In 2017, the Framingham Offspring study showed that individuals who consume less than 2.5 grams of sodium per day had consistently higher blood pressure than those who consumed 2.5 grams. So why the conflicting information?
Okay, so this is so all of those studies that he just talked about are from that Element company in their rebuttal to the FDA's recommendation to reduce sodium intake. So I think there's a good opportunity to talk about. A lot of times people won't even cite any sources. They won't even they'll just make claims like, well, you should be eating more sodium and not less, and not even offer you any sort of evidence. So these guys have offered evidence, and they're getting it from this company, Element. Okay, so Element has presumably looked at these studies, and they've come to their interpretation that the recommendations that we're getting don't align with the science. So let's talk about these studies here. And unfortunately, let me go into, here it is. So unfortunately, the only study that they actually link us to is the Framingham Offspring study, which is the last one that they talked about. But I did a Google search on the first one that they talked about. Okay, so they talked about three. So one was a study saying that people who have lower sodium had worse outcomes, and then they have a meta-analysis, and then the Framingham. So what came up when I Googled this first study is, again, from Harvard, and they talk about in the Journal of American Medical Association, which we talked about, May 4th, 2011. So it's this study that they're using as evidence. So Harvard actually has some issues with this study. Okay, so this study says, new study would have you believe that low salt diets raise your risk of dying from heart disease, a surprising finding and one that's sure to grab headlines worldwide. The only problem is that the study's conclusions are most certainly wrong. And so then they go on to talk about why that is. Let's see. So this study looked at 3,681 men and women for about 8 years. Okay, so nice long, kind of long trial here. And they report that people with the lowest levels of sodium in their urine, which is, we're going to get into this too, would be the gold standard of sodium collection, okay, is from your urine. At the start of the study, had 56% higher risk of dying from cardiovascular disease than people with the highest levels. Equally unexpectedly, among the 2,096 participants who had normal blood pressure at the start of the study, urinary sodium appeared to have no effect on the development of high blood pressure over 6.5 years. So let's get into why Harvard has an issue with this study.
Hey, I'd just like to throw something in there too.
Go ahead.
So again, there's a relationship. I may have mentioned this earlier. I don't know if I did or didn't, but there's a relationship between sodium and potassium. When sodium is high, potassium is low. When potassium is high, sodium is low. Sodium is super important for beyond everything circulatory and beyond everything that's like considered heart health and so forth. Sodium is super important for your brain function. So for example, if your body is too low on sodium, what I've discovered in my study is that in extreme cases it's a condition called hyponatremia. If you're in hyponatremia, you're in serious trouble. So those symptoms are like nausea, vomiting, loss of energy, confusion. At extreme levels, then you're going to be in seizures, death, things like that. But you don't see that from in medical journals that I've looked at, is that you don't see that in low sodium. Of course, too low sodium is bad as well. But then if you start lowering your sodium too far, then you have higher levels of potassium, and that is a whole nother set of issues. But that is like extreme low sodium. So I take issues with what that study says from Essential. It's like, yeah, I'm out on that. But go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to actually, so the Framingham study that they brought up talks about potassium and magnesium and calcium and sodium relationships
Right.
and cardiovascular disease. So we're actually going to get into that. So issues with this particular study. So they say the study has several weaknesses. Chief among them is its modest size, with less than 4,000 participants and only 84 deaths due to cardiovascular disease. The study is too small to support the author's sweeping conclusions.
Too narrow. Too narrow.
It's too narrow. There's not enough. There's not enough outcome, and 4,000 participants. I mean, like maybe that would be representative of Show Low, Arizona, but that's certainly not going to be representative of 7.5 billion people worldwide.
Right. Right. Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
They go on. Furthermore, the study's findings are inconsistent with a multitude of other studies conducted over the past 25 years. So we have 25 years of science
Yeah.
on this specific topic that are the reason behind the recommendations that we're getting.
I think he said that the study that he was quoting, that study was done like in 2016 or 2017.
2011.
Oh, 2011. There you go.
Yeah.
So please, come on.
Yep. So we have Walter Willett, who's the chair of the Department of Nutrition at Harvard School of Health, says take this study with a huge grain of salt. Okay, and then they
no
talk
pun
about,
intended.
yeah, they talk about some of the other issues here. So unreliable measurement of sodium intake. So we're going to talk about how measuring sodium intake is important when we're looking at these outcomes. So they did do urinary collection, 24-hour urinary collection, which would be the gold standard. Okay. The problem is they took a single measurement at the beginning of the study. So over the course of 8 years, there was one measurement on sodium intake, one 24-hour measurement. All right. They failed to account for key factors that influence sodium intake and heart disease. So people who are taller or more active tend to have lower risk of heart disease.
Right.
And they also tend to have higher sodium intakes simply because they eat more food.
Right.
Yet the JAMA study authors don't account for differences in height, physical activity, and total calories. That's important.
Right.
An increase in calories would be an increase in sodium intake. And the other weaknesses, there are problems with the way the investigators conducted the study, among them missing or incomplete data from large numbers of participants. They have incomplete urine samples. And what is it? They could have accounted for incomplete urine samples by analyzing urinary sodium in relation to creatinine, which is another thing, but they did not do that. Okay, so there are some issues with this study that they bring up in why, and when you take into account the issues that have come up in this study, we would expect to see the outcomes that they found. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, it does. It does. One of the things I wanted to say too is that one of the things that my wife says, and she's a working nurse practitioner in the emergency rooms, and she says that there's such a thing as like so salt, we'll say salt, but sodium follows water, or water follows sodium. So what they're talking about lower intake levels of sodium having high blood pressure, that it just doesn't work that way. That it just mechanically doesn't work that way. So, salt attracts water, sodium attracts water, water attracts sodium. So high blood pressure at a low level of sodium or low level of salt intake, it just doesn't happen. So the study is so flawed that it's like pseudoscience.
It can happen, and this is another flaw that are in a lot of the studies that are showing that lower sodium intakes correlates or produce higher rates of cardiovascular disease or mortality. So we're gonna get into that too. But let's talk about the second Go back to my Mendeley. Let's talk about the second study, which was the meta-analysis that they discussed. And so that one is actually found in this study that I have pulled up here, which is where we got the World Health Organization recommendation. And causal relationship between salt intake and blood pressure is well established, as evidenced by several lines of research, including animal experiments, human genetics, physiological studies, epidemiology, migration, population-based intervention studies, and clinical trials. Despite this, Groudal et al., I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, but this is the meta-analysis they're talking about. In a series of meta-analyses of randomized trials, including the latest update on one published in the Cochrane Library in April 2017, claimed that salt reduction had no or very little effect on blood pressure in normotensive individuals, so people without hypertension, and as such, population salt reduction was not warranted. However, this conclusion for public health is inappropriate given the nature of studies included in the meta-analysis, that is, trials of very short duration and comparing acute salt loading to abrupt and severe salt restriction, or 20 grams to less than 1 gram for only a few days. And so there's this prevalent notion within the online health and wellness space that randomized control trials are really the only way to go about assessing causal factors or causal inference. And so we can see here that this meta-analysis took in, only looked at trials that were very, very short duration. So they're probably a few days to a few weeks in length. And they're looking at salt loading, which I'm familiar with some of those, which means they're taking relatively young, like college students. They're recruiting them from colleges because college students will do trials for extremely little money. And so they're loading them with a whole bunch of sodium, so like 20 grams, and then they're dropping it to 1 gram per day. And they're looking at responsiveness from your circulatory system and your renal system and your endocrine system to dietary changes, rather than looking at the hard endpoints that we're concerned with, which is cardiovascular disease and mortality. So when you are assessing studies that really are looking at response to nutrition over a short period of time, and then taking that and inferring this long, because cardiovascular disease and mortality are things that take decades and decades and decades to develop.
Yeah, agreed.
You can't assess that in a trial that's a few weeks long and does weird things to young people. So if we get, if we take someone who's consuming 10 grams of sodium or 10 grams of salt a day, and then we bump that up to 20, and then we drop it down to 1, yeah, we're going to see some stuff happening.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Yeah. Agreed.
So they go on here. They talk about some other meta-analysis. So 2 other meta-analysis that excluded these short and acute salt restriction trials have demonstrated that a modest reduction in salt intake over a longer period of time, which corresponds to the current public health recommendation, has significant effect on blood pressure in both normotensive and hypertensive individuals, in men and women, and in all ethnic groups, with a linear dose-response relationship within the range from 3 to 12 grams a day. That is, the lower the salt intake, the lower the blood pressure.
Yeah.
And so there is, let me see if I can, I'll scale this down. So we're going to look at a graph that they have provided here. And so we talked a little bit about sodium measurement. So sodium, potassium, and some other things are what we would call recall nutrients or recall indicators, recall markers, because we can really assess dietary intake based on urinary excretion. So how much we're finding of those things in our urine. So the best method of addressing sodium intake would be to have a 24-hour urinary collection. So basically, if you were to go into a study and they were going to assess your sodium intake, they would send you home with a gas can. And for 24 hours, every drop of urine that you had would go into that gas can, and then you would send it to them and they would analyze that. Okay. And then what they have is a 24-hour recall of your sodium intake. Right. Now we can see that from that first study that we talked about, having only a single measurement really isn't going to give us a very good idea of average intake, because let's say that the researchers decided that they were going to go around and collect urine samples on a Friday. And Friday nights are when you go out to the steakhouse and you might decide that you're having your fish and chips, right? So on a single day, you could either have your highest sodium intake for the week or your lowest sodium intake for the week.
Yeah.
So what we would want are multiple 24-hour urinary recalls, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we would want that over the course of maybe several years. And that would give us a good idea of average intake over the lifespan, or at least over, half a decade to a decade, based on how long they're doing this stuff. So the one trial was 8 years long. Now, if they had been taking those 24-hour samples, maybe even once a year for 8 years, we would have 8 samples, and that would allow us to find an average over the 8 years. When we look at that, when we look at those types of studies that are taking into account 24-hour urinary recalls, and we're doing multiples of them over the course of many years, what we end up getting, like they talked about earlier, is a linear response between sodium intake and risk of death. This one has to do with the relative risk of death. When we look at studies that are assessing sodium intake by food frequency questionnaires or maybe food logs, they then have to use some formulas, and they also are going to compare what those people have written down in the food frequency questionnaires or the food logs, and they're going to try and find the sodium intake based on food databases, right? So there could be some variance in doing it that way, and then we're using formulas to come out. So when we do it that way, we find these J-shaped curves here, right? At the lower end, we're seeing increased risk in death, and at the upper end, we're seeing increased risk of death in both of these graphs on the right here, where, kind of in the middle, somewhere between that 3 to 6 grams per day. We're seeing this down here. So this is salt intake in grams per day. And these are actually a little bit high, but we're seeing this sweet spot somewhere in the middle, right? With the ends showing us these increases. But there's issues with the method of sodium collection. We also have a U-shaped curve, and this is coming from the Intersalt formula, which the Intersalt study was actually well done. We're going to talk about that a little bit. But U-shaped curve comes in where we have to apply a formula. Now there's another method of urinary collection, but it's a spot urinary collection. So where the 24-hour collection, they'll come and give you a gas can, and you're going to collect all of your urine for 24 hours. This one would be, they show up to your house on Friday, knock on the door and say, "Can you pee in this cup?" Right? So it's a spot sample, and your sodium intake throughout the day can vary. So what they're doing then is they're using a formula based on that individual spot collection, and then we're seeing a U-shaped curve come out of that. So this is why, so just looking at the method of sodium collection and the way that they're applying certain formulas, we can see how they're coming out with these findings of increased risk at the ends, at the tail ends of this thing, right? Versus 24-hour recalls, multiple 24-hour recalls over long periods of time. When we look at those, we see a linear response. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm seeing that. I'm just having trouble accepting it because if the gold standard, look at the gold standard there. It's the lower sodium you take in, the lower opportunity or the lower risk of death.
Lower risk of death. And
And
so, yeah.
yeah, but in any time, so all of the formulas, yeah, I'm having trouble with that. Anytime we work a formula there, then you increase the risk of death at the lower end of sodium intake, and then even the higher sodium intake on all the formulas is like a massive increase
Yeah.
compared to the gold standard. So math is not perfect, but they're just trying to. I don't know. I'm bewildered. As the
Bewildered.
ombudsman of the normal man, I'm going, yeah, I don't know. Anytime man starts trying to compensate for, quality measurements, I don't know.
So yeah, so these graphs here are just explaining how these researchers are coming up with this increased risk of mortality at lower sodium intakes. This is the
Right.
method of
Okay.
sodium collection and then the application of the formula used to find the averages of sodium intake.
Okay.
Okay.
Got
And
it.
so I have
Got it.
I have a red square right here on this U-shaped formula.
Mhm.
And what I want you to do is I want you to kind of ingrain this spline into your mind. Okay? Because we're going to go into the Framingham study that they talked about. All right. So now remember, they're saying that, so this is part of their evidence, right? This is the only study that they link to. And this study should show us that lower sodium intakes equal higher mortality rates, right?
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
And so just in the abstract here, and this is what most people explore. So when people want to actually look up studies on their own, a lot of people don't understand how to go into a study and assess the data in there. And so they'll just read the abstract. And what's written in the abstract can be misleading. So from
Yes.
the abstract here, I have a few things highlighted. They explored dose-response relations of sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium with cardiovascular disease risk in the Framingham offspring study. And they found that lower sodium intake, so less than 2,500 milligrams versus more than or equal to 3,500 milligrams, was not associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. And so we'll skim down here. Okay, so they're going to talk about materials and methods and a little background on the Framingham offspring study here. And so for this analysis, subjects who completed, data on the diet, cardiovascular disease, outcomes, and all confounders of interest who were between the ages of 30 and 64 years at examination visit 3, which is when the diet was first assessed, were eligible for inclusion. Now, we talked a little bit about lower sodium intakes equaling higher blood pressure. Who in the population would we expect to see on a low sodium diet?
Well, you would expect to see in older people.
Older people?
Older people.
Older people who have what?
Who already have some comorbidities
Like high blood pressure?
high blood pressure. Yes.
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 Okay.
Yes.
So we have another reason why we might expect to see increased rates of mortality at lower sodium intake. Who are the people that are consuming lower sodium diets? These are people who are generally already at risk for cardiovascular disease and higher rates of mortality, right? We may expect to see some whole food, plant-based vegans in there, But
Yeah, I'd like
vegans
to,
make up about 2% of the population.
yeah, I'd like to also throw in there though, so not necessarily just old people who already have high blood pressure, but also people who could be uh, normally considered candidates, like say morbidly obese.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, that's it. So people that are not healthy to begin with.
Yeah.
Overall health. Don't work out, don't
People, yes.
exercise,
Yeah.
morbidly obese and elderly, or people who have high stress jobs. In their upper ages, maybe 45 to 80ish or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we talk about age range and we're talking about cardiovascular disease and mortality specifically, so we have an age range here between 30 and 64. We're not really going to expect to see a whole lot of cardiovascular disease or mortality within that age range,
Right.
right? It would
Right.
be 65 and older,
Yes.
probably more 70 or older,
Yes.
where we would start to expect to see those things come in.
Yes.
Okay. So those are some things when looking at these studies that are calling for a reevaluation of the dietary recommendation on sodium. Who is the population that is comprising that low sodium group, right? And so in this study for the Framingham offspring, they have 2,362 subjects. Now, if we go back to our Harvard analysis of that first one, the first one looked at about 4,000 people. This one is 2,500 people. So we have even less people in this study, right?
Right.
Diet is assessed using 2 sets of 3-day diet records in the third and fifth examination cycles of the study. So how are they collecting sodium? Through 3-day diet records. Okay.
Again, super small numbers.
In super small numbers. Yep. And then this talks about how they went about collecting all that information from the dietary records and then coming up with an average sodium intake. And I actually like the way that they did it in this analysis because they actually based sodium intake on BMI, I believe it was. So it's actually a good method of assessment. And then they talk about some potential confounders here. So age, sex, we expect to see cardiovascular disease and mortality rates higher in men than in women. Height, so we already found out that taller people tend to suffer from these things less.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, education level, believe it or not. BMI, physical activity, cigarette smoking, alcohol intake, a wide range of individual dietary factors, a DASH diet eating pattern score, prevalent hypertension, use of anti-hypertensive medications, yada, yada, yada. And they go on through a whole lot of stuff. So let's go down and look at this. So this I found actually a little bit alarming. There was no confounding by a few of these things. Cigarette smoking, there was no confounding by cigarette smoking.
That's weird.
Alcohol intake, energy intake. Maybe I could understand a DASH eating score, but cigarette smoking, physical activity, alcohol intake, and energy, there was no confounding by those things. That's interesting, right?
What was the age group again?
30 to 64.
That's just kind of counterintuitive to everything we've ever been taught.
Yeah, kind of weird, right? So, all right. So let's get down into these graphs and let's see what they actually show us here. Because a lot of times what authors will put down and what their data actually show are two different things. So we have our sodium intake here in the red box, okay? And then we have this 2,500 milligram per day about thing showing us to be our zero reference. So off on the left here, a 1. So 1.0 is actually 0. Okay. And we're going to look at another chart down there and I'm going to explain a few things here. So the 1 line is actually the 0 line. So at 2,500 milligrams, we're seeing 0. So 0 impact on mortality and cardiovascular disease. Now, if you remember that spline curve that I showed you, what do we see in here? Right?
It's completely different than that previous graph.
So as intake is going up, they're showing a reduction I'm sorry, rather an increase in the risk. So a positive number is going to be an increase in risk. A negative number is going to be a decrease in risk. So as intake goes up, we see a little bump up in risk in the hazard ratio, and then it starts to come back down way up here at 5,000 milligrams of sodium intake per day. But remember, this study was supposed to show us that lower levels of sodium intake meant worse outcomes. But what we're seeing here is below 2,500 milligrams, we're seeing a reduction in risk. It's a very small reduction in risk, but it isn't positive. Right?
Yeah.
Correct. And so we have a few other things here. We're looking at 95% confidence intervals, and that's represented in the shaded area. So what that basically means here is this black line is our mean, and then the shaded area would be our confidence interval. So 95% of the people that we look at for this sodium intake and its outcome on cardiovascular disease are going to fall within 2 standard deviations of this line, which would be somewhere between these yellow arrows. But this black line doesn't actually represent the true line, right? It just means that if we were to perform this study 20 times, 19 out of 20 times, we would see it end up on this black line. But the true relationship could be anywhere in between these 2 dotted lines.
Right. Okay. I got it. Yep.
So if the shaded gray area crosses the 1 line, we consider the association to be null or no association at all. So when we looked at our abstract at the beginning of this, it said lower sodium intake, less than 2,500 milligrams per day, had no impact or no effect on cardiovascular disease. So that's what they're saying here is the 95% confidence intervals cross that null line, so it's considered as a null association. However, the trend is an inverse association. There is a decrease in risk clearly shown by this graph at lower sodium intake.
Below 2,500 milligrams.
Below 2,500. And this just goes down to 2,000. And I'm sure if we were to extrapolate this all the way down to 1,000 or 500, that line would just continue to go down. Right. So we have a few other things here, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And we can see that calcium, again, crosses this null association. So we're going to say that potassium intake generally has no effect on cardiovascular disease or mortality. However, potassium and magnesium, we do see a gap in between here, right? And so we would say that those actually do have an effect at higher intakes. And so when we have higher intakes of potassium and magnesium, that generally correlates to higher intakes of vegetables and fruits.
Right.
Yep.
Yes.
So what this chart here is not showing us is that lower sodium intakes equate to worse mortality. Now, remember, this is evidence that was cited to say that the current recommendations of reducing sodium are inappropriate. However, well, let's just continue down the range here. All right, so we have another chart here, and this is showing us some of our data collection that they have. We have our sodium intake, okay, our range is there, and our potassium intake, our range is there. And this is just kind of showing us the mean. And this is where they came to the conclusion that cigarette smoking and physical activity and all that didn't have any confounding, is because the cigarette smoking between all of the groups is pretty much similar. However, to say that it has no confounding is, I think, ludicrous.
Yeah, I think that's just yeah, I agree, ludicrous.
Yeah. All right, so we get down to this chart here, and they have hazard ratios for the risk of cardiovascular disease associated with categories of mineral intake. And so what they've done is we're looking at sodium based on intake. So below 2,500, 2,500 to 3,500, and then above 3,500, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and then the three ranges that they've separated it into. Now, again, this is evidence that the recommendations to reduce sodium intake are inappropriate. So below 2,500, so what we're actually looking at here is the reference range is 2,500 milligrams per day. And if we go up to our graph here, that's why we're seeing this null association here.
A 1, yeah.
So we can understand how these things are lining up, right? So they're actually not giving us the information below 2,500 milligrams, right? So even though this says less than 2,500 milligrams, we're actually not looking at that data. We're looking at 2,500 milligrams, which is our reference range. Right. So if we go from 2,500 to 3,500 milligrams or less, we see a 1.04. Now, a positive number over 1 indicates an increase in risk. So 1.04 would indicate a 4% increase in relative risk. And that is for the unadjusted. Now, after adjusting for the factors, the confounding factors that they talked about in the beginning, it 12%. Actually came to a 12% increase. Yep, right. Yep. And so once you get above 3,500 milligrams, we saw a 3% increase for the unadjusted, and the unadjusted is a 6% increase. So this is saying that as sodium intake increases above 2,500 milligrams, we are seeing an increased risk in cardiovascular disease.
Right. Yep.
Right.
Exactly.
And our chart above that showed us below 2,500 milligrams, we saw a reduction in risk. Right. And then, so the risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease for 2,500 to 3,500, we see an 11% increase in risk. And then above 3,500, we're seeing that 2%. Now, in the same respect where we're looking at the population who would compose our low sodium intake, what is the population that would comprise our high sodium intake?
It's going to be a younger group of people. And I would say anything from 20 to 45.
Younger, maybe more athletic.
Yeah.
Probably consume more calories.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's kind of weird that we're seeing this massive increase in the 2,500 to 3,500, but once we get about 3,500, we're seeing the risk come back down. Why would that be?
More active.
The population that we're looking at that consumes that intake.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. A more active group.
And then for these other things, so potassium, magnesium, and calcium, again, 2,500, we're looking at that reference range. And so once we get above that level, we start seeing reductions in risk. So 0.85 is less than 1.00. So that means a 15% reduction in relative risk. And then above 3,000 milligrams, we're seeing a 25% reduction in risk. Okay. So anything in red is an increase in risk for cardiovascular disease, and all these green markers are a decrease in risk. So what we're seeing is increases in sodium increases our risk. Increases in potassium, magnesium, and calcium decrease our risk. Right. And so now they've in this one, they've kind of taken sodium and potassium, and we have some ranges, and then sodium and magnesium and sodium and calcium, and we have some different ranges, and we're looking at the hazard ratios for those. So if we have like a low sodium intake below 2,500, or I'm sorry, a high sodium intake and a low potassium intake, our hazard ratio is 1. So that's our reference point. So if we have high sodium intake and high potassium, we're seeing this, what is that, 27%, 28% reduction in risk. So if you have high sodium, high potassium, we have a reduction in risk. If we have low sodium and low potassium, we still have a reduction in risk. It's just not as much. And if we have low sodium and high potassium, we see the greatest reduction in risk. Is that making sense?
Yes.
Okay. And we can do the same thing with magnesium all the way down. And now the The abstract in this, what most people are looking at and what most people were taking away was that reducing sodium in this trial, looking at the Framingham spring, really had no effect on it. And it really came down to the amount of potassium and magnesium that you were intaking. But we can see from this chart that when we have low sodium, high potassium, we have the lowest reduction in rate. When we have low sodium, high magnesium, we have the lowest reduction in risk. And when we have low sodium, high calcium, we have the lowest reduction in risk. So what this study actually tells us is that when we lower sodium intake and we increase our intake of fruits and vegetables, we have the lowest risk for cardiovascular disease. This study, if anything, supports the current recommendations.
Yeah, it does.
But it was used as evidence that the recommendations are inappropriate. So what does that tell us about the person utilizing this study as evidence to go against the current recommendations?
They're using voodoo.
They didn't read this thing.
No, they didn't read it. Yeah. Yeah.
They skimmed this part, this abstract, and interpreted what is said in there as we don't need to worry about lowering our sodium intake. It really comes down to potassium and magnesium. And in fact, lower, I'm not sure how they pulled lower sodium intake equals worse outcomes, but that seems to be what they took away from it.
Yeah, I think that they was. I think if they looked at those charts without looking at the rest, like when you scan down in the charts that were using the different formulas to normalize,
Mm-hmm.
then if you just look at that chart, that to me, that's probably where they went. Until you actually looked at the numbers, and especially the last thing we looked at which compared high sodium to high potassium, scenario is this, and then high sodium, low potassium. Those are the numbers that really made the difference. But if you just look at those charts, and where I was going, I don't know. When you're using a formula to fix things, to try to get it back to what, to relationship with the gold standard. Well, if you just look at that chart, it's like, holy cow. Because I don't know if whoever's watching this, if you saw me looking at those graphs, I'm going, what? Because that sharp rise at low sodium and the sharp rise at the high sodium and everything in the middle was kind of low, and going, that ain't right.
Yeah.
That ain't right, man. So that's, yeah.
Yep.
Sometimes people can look at, you can make statistics look, say pretty much anything you want to, if you're not paying attention to how things were collected and what were the confounding factors.
Mm. Yeah,
You agree?
and a lot of times the language that's put in the abstract, while it is accurate, so what they said in that particular one was that lowering sodium intake didn't have any effect. They're correct based on the 95% confidence intervals crossing the null, right? However, what they should have gone on to say that the trend is a reduction in risk, because people come away with the wrong thing from that abstract when people don't go into the study and don't actually look at the tables and the charts and the graphs and what the numbers are actually telling us. The language that is used in studies can be somewhat misleading to the average person. And that's a big reason why we're going through this and why we're doing this. Right. I agree. And we're going to see in the weeks coming, we're going to go through blog posts, and I'm going to utilize the evidence provided in most of these things, refuting their own claims. Right. Yeah. So I want to look at a couple other things here. We'll go over it real quick, and then we'll end this thing. So the effects of sodium intake on health and performance in endurance and ultra endurance athletes. So these guys in this video go on to talk about how and this is also very prevalent in most of the athletic space online, is, well, if you're sweating a lot, then you really need to be concerned with replacing the amount of sodium or salt that's lost in your sweat. Athletes need to be more concerned with that. And so, this analysis right here goes into talking about that. So how much sodium or salt should athletes, and these are endurance athletes, so we're talking about people who are out in the environment for multiple tens of hours, right? Going, almost redline the entire way. So we're going to look at the recommendations for sodium and salt intake for those athletes. And then maybe we'll talk about the average person who spends 8 to 10 hours a day in an air-conditioned office and then goes to work out in an air-conditioned gym, right? What should the recommendations be for that person?
Yeah, so like an ultra endurance sport. I mean, that's like some guys that run those they call them ultras, those
Ultra
super long
marathons.
rides. Yeah, those people are crazy. Nothing personal, but man, that's a long time.
100
So
miles of running.
that's ridiculous.
Crazy.
But that's an ultra endurance sport.
Yep. All right. So in the abstract here, they say the majority of reviews on sports nutrition issue focus on macronutrients, which is what we generally talk about, right? Your protein, carbs, and fat and calories, and paying less attention to stuff like sodium. There are no reviews that focus entirely on the effects of sodium, and in particular on endurance sports. So this is the first analysis of its kind to actually specifically look on the impact of sodium in regards to both health and performance relation in athletes. All right. And so a lot of this is because they talk about a lot of different studies in this, trying to go over all of these graphs individually can be somewhat confusing.
Yeah.
So I know that, here we go. We're just going to get down to their conclusion, right? So thus the ideal amount of sodium intake in the largest range of the population, and remember, this is the population they're talking about are endurance athletes, appeared to be in the range of 1.5 grams per day. Now the WHO, the World Health Organization recommendation is less than 2 grams per day. So based on the analysis, and I can't remember how many studies this is. So they looked from 1900 to 2021. They explored all of the literature on sodium and its impact on health and performance from 1900 to 2021. And I may be wrong, it may be another one, but I want to say they came up with like 230, well, they actually came up with like 15,000 studies, but based on their inclusion criteria, it came down to like 230 studies or something like that. So I'm not really sure how many more studies you would need as evidence, okay? So the ideal amount of sodium intake is 1.5 grams per day. However, it's equally important for endurance athletes to consume 300 to 600 milligrams of sodium per hour. Now, 1 gram of salt has about 400 milligrams of sodium in it. So while these athletes are racing and they are sweating, the recommendation would be to consume a little bit under 1 gram of salt per hour.
Yeah, but those guys are also like you said, and we've said several times, so it's like an ultra endurance kind of thing.
Correct. Yeah.
So their bodies are at like full blast, red line all the way.
Yeah. So that's while they are doing their races, the amount to replenish that would be less than 1 gram per hour. Okay. And so it's also noted that there's no documented scientific evidence on the relationship between sodium and muscle cramps. So that was kind of new for me. That's something that's out there in the literature. And then for hyponatremia, which you had brought up, sodium intake can mitigate the drop in blood concentrations, but it cannot eliminate it.
Right.
So the impact of sodium on hyponatremia is less than it's being let out to be. All right. And finally, attention should first be paid to the individual amount of fluids consumed and then to the sodium.
I agree with all of that. I agree with that. And I've never really heard about sodium being related to muscle cramps. I always thought it was more about potassium and magnesium. Is that wrong?
Yeah, so I've heard a little bit about the sodium being related to it. So, for there actually not to be any evidence is a little bit surprising to me. But again, that's one of those things where I'm trying to get past this, normal thing in the coaching industry where we just repeat what we hear and we're not actually investigating these things for ourselves.
Right.
So as I dig through all of this research, it's something that I'm trying to overcome. Stop repeating what you hear someone else saying. Go look the evidence up on your own. And a lot of times you find most of the stuff out there is just absolutely wrong.
In the video we saw earlier too, it's like when we see something on YouTube or we see something on, some kind of social media, and if the guy's like, looking really good, he's like, it's just wrong, stupid. Then we go, oh yeah, he's got to be right. He's just repeating stuff.
Yeah.
Not just him, but I mean other people. People just repeat stuff. So I appreciate the fact that you go into and you're looking at the studies and you're breaking them down point by point and doing comparisons. I appreciate that a lot.
Yep. And so we have another systematic review and meta-analysis on the effects of lower sodium intake on health. And so just to get through stuff here pretty quickly from the conclusion here, high quality evidence in non-acutely ill adults shows that reduced sodium intakes reduces blood pressure and has no adverse effect on blood lipids, catecholamine levels, or renal function, and moderate quality evidence in children shows that a reduction in sodium intake reduces blood pressure. Lower sodium intake is also associated with a reduced risk of stroke and fatal coronary heart disease in adults. The totality of evidence suggests that most people will likely benefit from reducing sodium intake.
And that's looking at studies from 1900 to 2021.
Well, no, this is a different.
Oh, okay, my bad. I was like, wait, is that the same one?
Yeah, the last one was on sodium and sports performance.
That's right, and I apologize.
And this one is looking at the impact on health. So low sodium in particular, and its impact on health.
Okay, my bad.
And then there are a few others. So one of the things in the beginning that he said is that salt is essential for function and life. And you hear this a lot. There are actually quite a few people in the online space saying that salt is essential. You have to have salt in your diet, and we need to be consuming more salt and not less. Well, okay, so if that were true, if salt was necessary for life, then I should not be able to find a population anywhere in the world, past or present, that has ever been a no salt culture. Correct?
Correct. Wow.
So we're going to zoom in on this one here. So previously, we identified the Yanomamo Indians of northern Venezuela and southern Brazil to be a people existing without mineral salt, so sodium chloride, or substances of high salinity. All right, and this goes on to talk about some other things. So a parallel finding in these groups. So there are several groups. There are several, what do we call them? Pre-modernized world. So there are ancestral cultures still existing today that are no salt cultures, right?
That's amazing.
They find that the blood pressure having been measured is consistent with the absence of hypertension throughout the span of adult life, although the associated physiological adjustments include marked increases of renin and aldosterone. From the perspective of the 3 or more million years postulated for the evolution of man, if you believe that, the use of salt is a very recent event and unnecessary for health as a consequence of the adequate of homeostatic responses for sodium conservation despite widely varying dietary customs. So what they're saying there is that these populations that are no salt or low salt tend to not have age-related hypertension issues that we see in Western populations. So they kind of they have an increase. This study right here specifically talks about the Yanomamo Indians. So low frequency of hypertension among unculturated peoples. Initial examinations revealed the failure of blood pressure to increase with age, as it was decided to explore their sodium balance and determine for the first time some of the hormonal adjustment characteristics of a no salt culture. So salt is not required for life. You do not have to consume salt. Sodium is a requirement, but you can find sodium in adequate amounts in most of the
vegetables. Yeah, there's this in vegetables too, isn't it?
Fruits, vegetables. It's found in almost everything. Okay?
Beautiful, beautiful.
And so we have some blood pressures here obtained by the Yanomamo Indians. So males 0 to 9, we got 93 for the systolic and 58 for the diastolic. And then as they go up in age, so about at 10 years old, we see this little bump up in blood pressure, and then it just kind of stays there for their whole life. So we're looking at 100 to 110 systolic and like 60,
that's amazing.
65 to 70 for the diastolic for their whole life.
That's amazing.
So this should also dispel the notion that lower sodium intakes are going to equal worse health outcomes, higher mortality, higher cardiovascular disease, right? When we have a population that consumes no salt and they have no age-related blood pressure issues, and they also do not have huge incidence of cardiovascular disease, right? There's incidence of there is atherosclerosis within all human populations, both living and past. However, the rates of incidence, so heart attack, stroke, death, that sort of stuff, is basically non-existent in these no-salt cultures.
Wow.
Okay. And then we have down here at the conclusion, the customary quantities of salt in contemporary diets far exceed the amount necessary to maintain sodium balance and result in depressed levels of the sodium-related hormones, renin and aldosterone. So from that last article we saw in the no-salt culture, they have elevated levels, but those elevated levels don't actually result in any poor outcomes. Right.
Wow.
And so what they're saying here is that our higher levels of elevated salt are actually depressing the hormones renin and aldosterone. And so if we were to remove the sodium from our diet, we would actually see those levels go back up, and higher levels of renin and aldosterone are probably more physiologically
advantageous.
Yeah. So
wow.
This all comes back to his initial question: why are the recommendations what they are? Because that is what the evidence shows.
Take that, Bobby Flay.
Take that, Bobby Flay.
Salt.
So there you go. So as the audience on Budsman, what are your thoughts here?
Well, my thoughts are that well, I can say this. First of all, I can say this. So, for those that don't know, I've worked out with Dustin for a long time, and we went through a period of reduced salt intake. In fact, I still do that, and up until recently, for other reasons, I actually felt better. I felt better. So I haven't taken care of myself all this, for all my life, and ate stupid and didn't exercise, didn't pay attention to my nutrition. But having read all of this, I don't believe there's anything that is significantly a problem with a lower salt intake. So to lower salt intake, lower my sodium intake, um, I don't see any significant risks to my health to do that. As an older guy, yeah, I think that lowering my salt intake, keeping my sodium intake down would be a very healthy thing for me to do.
Hmm.
Just eating good foods. We just eat so much that as an adult, I mean, it's just as Americans, I think maybe even globally, people just eat so much that we we trade we trade health for flavor sometimes, and well, a lot. And
Yeah.
we eat a lot of processed foods that we don't really think about how much sodium and how much salt we're taking in.
Mhm.
So the thing about the Indians, think about the no salt uh, uh, people, and I don't think the Venezuelans, I can't even pronounce the tribe name or anything.
Yanomamo.
Them. So they're not the only ones on the planet that do that. I can't think of
Mhm.
them right now, but there are other cultures that they don't eat a large amounts of salt, but their sodium intake is taken care of by what they eat, and
Mhm.
also um, the levels in their body, the chemistry in their body is better managed just by the increased levels of renin and aldosterone. So, what do I think about it? Man, lower your sodium,
Yeah.
lower your salt. We
There
don't
was
need it that much.
there was one more. I want to share this one with you. So this is the one that had the 232 studies in there.
Right.
So the issues with high salt intake don't don't just apply to cardiovascular disease or mortality. There are also outcomes associated with cancer and bone health. But this analysis here on stomach cancer and kind of the things that are most um, associated or causal with stomach cancer was pretty shocking to me. And so I just want to go over this a little bit with you. So this is the one where we have 232 studies with 33,831,63 participants. So 34 million participants, 232 studies. Okay. And
Wow.
again, if you need a significant amount of evidence and a significant amount of participants, I don't know how much more you could ask for
That's massive. That's
than
a
this,
huge pool.
right? Yes.
Yes.
Um, and so I forget where it is in here. Let's go down. Okay, so there are the things most associated. So we're looking at the odds ratios here. So H. pylori infection. And again, anything over 1, so we see 1 down here at the bottom, that's our null. And anything positive is going to be an increased risk. Anything negative is going to be decreased risk. So H. pylori, we're actually looking at a 156% increase in the risk, in the hazard ratio of stomach cancer from H. pylori. So if you have some diarrhea or stool that's lasting for more than 2 weeks, you need to go get that checked out. Maybe you contact Kathy over there, because if it's H. pylori, it's not just not a big deal. H. pylori is a big deal.
Yeah.
Current cigarette smoking, 61% increase. Former cigarette smoking, 43% increase. Current alcohol drinking, 20% increase. Former alcohol drinking, a 73. And you might think, well, why former is higher than the current drinking? And that's because former drinkers probably consist of people who drank a lot and then had to quit because they have developed issues, right? Like alcoholic fatty liver disease or something like that. Maybe they're starting to get stomach cancer or something like that.
Right.
Body mass index, so BMI. So actually being overweight or obese had a negative correlation, so a reduction in risk. Sufficient physical activity, we see about a 5% reduction in risk. Fruit intake, about a 50% reduction in risk.
Wow,
Vegetable
that's
intake,
huge.
yeah,
That's
vegetable
huge.
intake, about a 40%. Pickled vegetable intake, 28% increase in risk. Now, why is that? 28% increase in risk. 28% increase in risk. Current alcohol drinking, 20% increase. Former alcohol drinking, a 73. And you might think, well, why former is higher than the current drinking? And that's because former drinkers probably consist of people who drank a lot and then had to quit because they have developed issues, right? Like alcoholic fatty liver disease or something like that. Maybe they're starting to get stomach cancer or something like that. Pickled
Sodium
vegetables
in
are
it.
sodium. Yeah. Drinking black tea had kind of no effect. Drinking green tea, we see a small reduction in risk there, about 12%. Drinking coffee, about a 1% reduction in risk. Fish intake, I'm always pushing fish. We see about a 20% reduction in intakes. Red meat intake, greater than 4 times per week, 31% increase in risk.
Yeah, I'd like to say that was important. Greater than 4 times a week. And
Greater than 4.
what blows my mind is the numbers on fruits and vegetable intake. Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
And then we come down here to salt. Okay, so the odds ratio for salt intake of above 5 grams per day versus less than 5 grams per day, and the recommendation is less than 5 grams per day, was 3.78. So that is a 278% increase
Wow.
in the odds ratio, in the hazard ratio of stomach cancer.
Wow.
Okay. Now, this is from 2 studies. One of them showed that 3.78 hazard ratio, and another one showed a 1.34, so 34%. So if we just take the average between 3.78 and 1.34, we're somewhere in the range of 250. So we're somewhere in the range of a 150% increase between these 2 studies. Okay. Both studies report high intake of salt significantly increase the risk of stomach cancer. So not just for cardiovascular disease, lowering your salt intake is important for other things. Like I say, bone health, we didn't even get into bone health in this discussion, but salt actually competes with calcium in your kidneys for reabsorption and reuptake. And so if you have a high sodium intake and you have high sodium concentration in your blood, that sodium can actually outpace the rate of calcium reabsorption, and you can actually have a decrease in bone mineral density. So, hammer at home. Why are the recommendations what they are? Because the evidence, the overwhelming proportion of evidence suggests that when we go below 5 grams a day for salt, or 200 milligrams, I think it's 2,300 for the average American, 2,300.
Right.
We see improved health outcomes below those ranges. That's why the recommendations are what they are. And we have studies that show different outcomes than that other stuff. And that's fine. It's also expected based on statistics, on averages. So if we had 100 studies, we would expect that some of those would show different outcomes than the vast majority of them. That is expected, right? If we had 100 studies and they all said the same thing, that would be kind of weird.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So it's not only is it normal to see that, but we also see that there are issues in the methods of data collection. So there are issues in the methods of sodium collection. There are issues in how they are assessing average intakes of sodium. There are issues in who are the populations that are consisting of our high and low sodium intakes, and why are we seeing the health-related outcomes that we are at those ends.
Oh, no, I'm still here with you. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay. Oh, your video's frozen. All right. So I've explained why the recommendations are what they are, and I've explained why people who have issues with the recommendations, what is the issue with the evidence that they're looking at and why they're coming to that wrong conclusion.
Right.
Right. So on the whole, how much sodium should we be taking in? Less than 2 milligrams per day.
Less than 2 milligrams a day. Yeah. Which is about, exactly.
It's 5 grams of salt. So about a teaspoon and a half per day. And if you just limit the amount of processed foods, as you were saying, you can get there, right? You can get down to 2,000 milligrams. It's not fun, but
it's just a change. It's just a change.
Yeah.
And increase vegetables, increase fruits, exercise. We
Yep.
don't really need all that salt for flavor. We don't. We just don't.
Yep. So
And
everything we looked at today supports the current recommendations.
right.
And some of it was evidence, against saying we need to reevaluate the recommendations, but that evidence supports the recommendation. So
Yep.
that's it. I have no final thoughts. Anything from you, Poppy Dwarrel?
No, man, it's been enlightening. I just there were times that you're going through that stuff, and my mind was being blown so bad. I was just going, and I'd start doing this. I'm like, you see my head cocking
Yeah.
over like a puppy who hears a high pitched whistle. I'm going, man, I had no idea. Had no idea.
Yep.
Just mind blown.
Yep. So hopefully somebody gets something from this podcast. Hopefully I have dispelled some myths. I certainly haven't conclusively disproven anything. But as far as the current dietary recommendations on sodium go, I think that we've made a pretty good case that the recommendations are what they are because that's what the evidence is leading us to.
Exactly. Yeah, agreed. Completely.
All right.
Completely agree.
So, Dwayne, thanks for joining me. To all the listeners and viewers, thanks for joining me today. I hope you get something out of this. And that concludes our podcast. Lambie out.